Hello everyone, I'm Rob, I'm a registered dietitian, and in this week's episode I wanted to talk about dairy and health, specifically focusing on the link between butter and cardiovascular disease. So within the classification dairy, we have a number of different foods that have different nutritional compositions and a varied food matrix, all which can impact the health consequences of the food quite significantly. For that reason, it can be unhelpful to classify foods as dairy and discuss their impact on health. We need to take a closer look examining different foods because of these different properties. Ultimately, this is because dairy products undergo different refinement processes to make the end product. It is these processes that seem to impact on the healthfulness of the end product. So, for example, butter is produced by separating the cream from the whole milk. This cream is then churned until all of the milk liquids are separated out, leaving the fat solids. This gives quite a significantly different nutritional composition, and in this example, butter is often a lot higher in fat, in particular saturated fat, and lower in calcium than, say, compared to cheese. Due to these processes, we find that different dairy products will have vastly different impacts on cardiovascular disease risk as a result of their nutritional profile having a direct impact on blood lipids, in particular cholesterol. Historically, dairy has been implicated in the development of cardiovascular disease mainly due to its saturated fat content. However, the outcomes tend to be a bit more nuanced once we take a closer look at the different types of dairy product. This nuanced view is supported in the literature. When we take a closer look, foods such as butter tend to have a much greater impact on LDL cholesterol, which is implicated in cardiovascular disease, than, for example, cheese, despite both products having quite a significant amount of saturated fat. This cholesterol-raising effect of butter may underscore the link between increased butter intake, increased saturated fat intake, and increased cardiovascular disease mortality. This association was most clearly demonstrated with the Finnish North Karelia public health intervention from 1972 until 2005. In 1965, the per capita intake of butter was about 18 kilograms in the Finnish population. By 2005, this had reduced down to just 3 kilograms. This was thanks to a prolonged public health campaign aimed at reducing the four main factors for cardiovascular disease. This included blood pressure, blood cholesterol, smoking, and obesity. The most significant dietary intervention during this time was a 50% reduction in the population's saturated fat intake, seen mainly through the reduction of butter. This correlated with a significant population-wide reduction in cholesterol levels, resulting in an even more significant reduction in cardiovascular disease mortality of 80%. In comparison, an inverse relationship between cheese intake and cardiovascular disease, in particular a reduced risk of stroke, has been consistently shown. The reduction in risk of myocardial infarction in a Swiss cohort who had higher cheese intakes was analysed, and it was found that it was the increased calcium intake that seemed to be protective. This suggests that the calcium in the cheese matrix may be the mediating factor for this decreased risk. There is some mechanistic plausibility to this argument. The calcium can form soaps in the intestine, which prevents the absorption of some saturated fat and increases its excretion. This may reduce the impact of dairy foods including calcium. However, this would not include butter, as the churning process reduces quite a significant amount of this. For example, cheddar cheese contains almost 30 times more calcium than butter. In dairy, fat globules are trapped within a casein matrix in a protective encapsulation known as the milk-fat globule membrane. Research has shown that dairy within this membrane does not impair cholesterol levels. When we examine butter, we find that the process of churning removes this milk-fat globule membrane. There are also a number of other potential mechanisms that result in dairy products other than butter having beneficial effects on health, such as fermentation of cheese or other fermented dairy products such as kefir. Many intervention studies have found that butter will have a negative consequence on blood cholesterol in comparison to cheese, which tends to both reduce total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. Thus, consumption of full-fat cheese seems to indicate there's more to the story than just the fat content. There seems to be a complementary effect between the milk fat, casein, and calcium within the whole food matrix. Nevertheless, it should be stated that low-fat dairy is strongly associated with reduced risk of stroke. The nutritional characteristics of milk, yogurts and cheese are essential for considering their impact on cardiovascular disease. These characteristics may contribute to a blood pressure reducing effect of dairy consumption. This supports observational evidence of reduced risk of stroke and hypertension with intake of low-fat dairy and yogurt. There is also strong evidence of a protective effect from yogurt and low-fat dairy on type 2 diabetes. However, we're not entirely sure yet if this is anything specific to do with these foods or whether they just help people to maintain a healthy body weight. Reducing your total intake of saturated fat is very likely to be beneficial for anyone at high risk of cardiovascular disease. My advice would be to limit concentrated sources of saturated fat such as butter and to replace these with polyunsaturated fats such as vegetable oils. The vast majority of the evidence suggests this is the best way to lower your cholesterol and thus your cardiovascular disease risk. If anyone watching has seen changes in their lipid profile from either decreasing or increasing their butter intake, I'd be very interested to know. Anyway, that's it from this week's video. I do hope you've enjoyed. If you did, give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more health and nutrition content, then please subscribe to the channel. See you in the next one. Cheerio.